We live in a rather diverse world, and we're going to look at least in this short video, diversity as we see it in the American classroom and how we might define a better way than what we find most school systems in identifying what a truly at-risk child is. We'll very quickly look at inclusion and special education and its primary focus on handling diversity there, and then what Kansas is doing to fulfill the RTL mandates by No Child Left Behind in their implementation of MTSS. One of the questions in your Chapter 4 questions and activities is question number 1, and so this might help you answer this question to define and characterize in your own words what an at-risk student would be. And from your experience, what would you add to what we're going to find, at least what Phi Delta Kappa found as an at-risk child? Well, let's look at how we teach all children that come before us in the public school system. You know, diversity comes in a lot of shapes and sizes in a lot of different ways. We see gender differences, race differences, differences in body size, color of hair, and the like. Biologically, we have a vast array of differences even within each of our classes. When we look at cultures, even in southeast Kansas, a wide variety of cultures sitting in front of us with their own customs and values and sense of identity. We see language differences and dialects and second language learners now in many of our classrooms. I had a speech professor at Marshall who could tell us at our first day when we introduced ourselves by our dialect what county we were from in West Virginia. The dialects were that distinct, or his ear to hear that was that distinct. We have diversity in the way our families are structured and the size of the families, the values of the families, the traditions of the families, the number of caregivers that we find responsible for the children in the family. We see vast economic differences in the state of Kansas and in all states with family incomes and what they have, the resources they have to help children, and the socioeconomic status as Bob Coleman found in 1966 was a significant factor in, at least in his eyes, in being successful in the American school. We see religious diversity and philosophical beliefs sitting in front of us, and much of our recent legislation has been over the separation of church and state and religious beliefs and their place in the American school. The way we feel about certain regions of our state or even a city, that sometimes those from the farmlands are a little bit different from the suburbs of Olathe. Geography perhaps plays some difference in perceptions. Experiences that kids bring to school with them, the work experiences some have or don't have, their ability to travel. Have they been out of a 50-mile radius of their own town? And what they get to do for recreation and the amount of money they might have to do those things. We've seen a vast interest in looking at multiple intelligences and aptitudes, and we see those sitting in front of us with different types of intelligences and aptitudes. We see the learning styles, their environmental factors and how they affect what a kid does and what he learns. And then, of course, in special ed, we have a vast array of definitions for educational dysfunctions, and they seem to change every other decade. When I was being trained in school, retardation, and we actually would term a child retarded, It was not a derogatory term. But since then, we have much different ways now of describing different types of dysfunctions with LD, BD, ADD, and the like. So student diversity can be viewed through lenses quite varied. Well, we've seen diversity transforming our classrooms, and we've seen it change. Even the perception of diversity is changing. Back 30 years ago, we sort of had the philosophy that America was a great melting pot, and that all that entered its shores and were educated in its school systems were expected to blend. And now we see perhaps instead of being a melting pot with one flavor, we have a tossed salad with a variety of colors and flavors, and we appreciate those colors and flavors. So diversity is not a thing that is negative. Just because a classroom is full of different kids and each kid is different does not make that or put that person at risk of failing just because he's different. Let's look at at-riskness and how we might define a truly at-risk child. Many different ways of looking at riskness. Would this child be considered at risk? Looks kind of painful, but I don't know if she might be considered at risk. Let's see what the research says. Back in the early 60s, there were several different ways of coming up with a rating scale of stressors that impacted a person's life to the extent that the amount of energy used to readjust would get in the way of life, that would change them. And with death of the spouse being the highest, divorce, marital separation, jail time, death of a close family member being those higher stressors that would indicate that perhaps there was great enough stress that it would impinge upon their ability to do other things, to be successful in school. Well, Phi Beta Kappa sort of took off on the indicator idea, and in 1972 conducted the largest study ever done on at-risk kids. 21,000 students participated, and even Pittsburgh State participated through Dr. Dick Lipka. And they looked at elementary, middle school, and high school students on a number of different indicators. I think there were well over 120 different indicators, and through multiple regression and other factors, they were able to find significance in certain indicators, and they fell within 5 factor ranges: personal pain, family tragedy, family socioeconomic status, family instability, and academic failure. And they put these factors, identified each, and entitled the book, "Students Growing Up is Risky Business and Schools Are Not to Blame." Let's look exactly at what they found under each of these 5 different factors. Under personal pain, they found that at-risk students tended to have been suspended from school. They may have attempted suicide, that they were involved in perhaps a pregnancy, they had sold drugs, they had used drugs, they had used alcohol, been arrested, were sexually or physically abused, or had family members who used drugs, or had parents who were alcoholics. These tended to come to the forefront as indicators possibly of a student being at risk. They found in the area of family tragedy that if a parent was sick last year, or the parent died, or he lost his job, or one of the student's friends had died, or was in an accident, or a sibling had died, those were indicators in the area of the family that the child would possibly be at risk. If the father was unemployed or held an unskilled job or had not graduated from high school, or the mother was unemployed or the mother didn't graduate from high school, the parents had a negative attitude about education, or English was not spoken as the primary language in the home, these also became significant indicators. In fact, in southeast Kansas, the number one of the top 5 indicators was the mother holding employment and whether or not she graduated from a high school. And I guess if you think that through, in southeast Kansas, we have approaching in most of the counties over 50% of our children living with a single parent mother, and a high percentage of those are living with their mother. And so if it would depend on the mother's educational level as to what level of job they had and income coming in, a lot of factors would impinge upon that. But Dr. Lipka found that that was one of our high indicators of children in southeast Kansas. Another area we looked at the study looked at was family instability, and 4 indicators came from that. Students that didn't live with the real mother or father, the students moved frequently, they changed schools frequently, or the parents were divorced, all indicators of family instability, and were significant factors in indicating an at-riskness. And then academic failure, that students got low grades in schools, that students failed a course, that had been retained, that was overaged, had excessive absences. A student had low self-esteem, had been referred to special ed, and had low standardized test scores, which were defined as below the 20th percentile on their standardized test. These were also primary indicators. So what came to the forefront were 34 variables in which the study put into 5 factor areas, and 2 major conclusions the authors derived. That was that academic failure, that is the last one, was caused by the other 4 factors, that is the personal pain, the family tragedy, the social family instability, and socioeconomic status. These were the causes of academic failure. And that personal pain was caused by the 3 family factors, the family tragedy, socioeconomic, and instability factors. So they worked many times in tangent to cause one thing to happen after another. Some of the other conclusions they found was that children who often fail, they fail in everything they do. And when children start to hurt, they hurt all over. And that older children tend to be more at risk than younger children. We found in the demographics that the blacks were more at risk than whites, Hispanics were more at risk than Asians, boys were more at risk than girls, and in fact, we found 1 out of 4 students had 3 or more risk factors, and 1 out of 5 had no risk factors. So only, when you look at it, only about 20% of our students in the American school at that time had no risk factors. So in essence, if a child answered yes to 5 or more of these items, the 34, he or she may be considered at risk. And the authors sort of pointed out, and at least from my life experiences, I think many a child, one time or another in their life, is at risk of not succeeding as they go through school. Because we have good years and bad years, and sometimes nasty things do happen. So at-riskness was defined by specific indicators. Typically in the Kansas school system, we define a child as being at risk by one simple indicator of whether or not he's on a free and reduced lunch. I think this must be a better system than that, and I think common sense would tell us these factors perhaps would be better than whether or not they were simply enrolled in the free and reduced lunches. Well, we're going to ask that in question 1 in your chapter activities for chapter 4 to define in your own words what an at-risk kid is, And from your experiences, what would you add to these 30-some indicators? Would there be some other factors that you think impinge upon whether or not a school is at risk? Be interesting to see what you come up with. Well, if a kid is identified at risk, what can we do to help them?
I am at risk to fail.
Many kids know that they're at
I'm at
risk
risk to get pregnant.
simply because of their surroundings and looking at other kids. What can we do to keep them from failing our American schools? Well, let's look at some factors. Typically, research will tell us that there are certain things that will work for certain teaching situations for most every child. Marzano, which we'll later look at in Chapter 5, and others have found a number of things that are correlated with success in our classrooms. Using graphic organizers and concrete examples and analogies, one way. Teaching to the learning styles where kids can touch and manipulate what they're learning. The equal distribution of questions and the use of feedback in a positive sense where every kid does answer, that you stay with the kid till he gives you the answer, and that you do it more times than once or twice, hopefully, in a day of a kid's life. That repetition, moving something from short-term to long-term memory, is a key to academic success. That repetition has to be correct, so correctives play an important role. Using technology for that repetition or for enrichment, especially for those children that come from homes that don't have computers, will be a key, at least the research tells us later on, in their success. Teaching to the multiple intelligences, to the different learning styles, to get kids to solve problems and process information. We call this metacognition skills. Teaching them how to think is one of the keys to getting our kids to be successful. Mastery learning with reteaching and enrichment, where kids, if learning is truly a matter of time, we give kids a second and third chance to relearn that material. And grouping kids by multiple abilities, we call that heterogeneous grouping rather than homogeneous grouping and tasking, where lower achieving children do have role models for success. Using gaming and play. We're real good at that in the elementary school. Sometimes don't find that as prevalent in the secondary schools. And gaming and play. Kids learn, research tells us, through play. One of the first methods that we learn as babies. And then project-based learning, cooperative learning, both research-based, found success in academic achievement. So these are common techniques that later we'll talk about in Chapter 5 and 6 that research tells us do have a higher probability of working. Well, when you constantly use those, sometimes they're not going to work for every child. And so when it happens that we don't find success, we accommodate and we modify. Well, let's look at what those two terms mean. When kids don't learn by the traditional methods, we first can accommodate, where we ask them to do what everyone else is doing, but we may have some additional support or some changes. And when we modify, we are going to do something like it, but it's going to be modified in some way. It's going to be somewhat different. So let's look at how these might be used and some of the techniques real quickly. Typically, accommodations are used for classroom instruction and testing. It provides equity rather than an advantage if it's used correctly. It's typically, especially in a child that's been identified for special ed, will be listed in the individual and educational plan, the IEP, for those kids simply at risk, and MTSS, maybe not so much written down, but we accommodate and we change things, and we can have a whole list of types of accommodations, like maybe writing shorter papers, providing just special verbal help, taking more breaks, using more manipulatives, or studying more with flashcards. It could be a simple thing as finding them a quiet place to work, because sound does bother them. It could be highlighting their textbooks as to where the main points were. So could be a host of different things that would simply add to what the other kids are doing to give them some special types of ways to learn. Some more, sometimes those that aren't oral listeners can't take things by listening. We could type out the lectures or provide them study notes to fill in as they listen. We could provide them a study buddy. We could do daily homework checks for them rather than self-grading. Whatever would seem to work to make that kid successful is an accommodation, but yet is doing what almost everybody else is doing, just with a little additional help. And now a modification is doing something like or totally different from what everyone else is doing. It's again used in classroom instruction and testing. Typically in special ed requirements, it's a kid performing below the 2.5 percentile, and it's listed typically in the IEP because it does change the way the kid is taught pretty dramatically a lot of times. And these could be test modifications, giving them a lower level material, could be much more repetition, giving the reading material at a lower level, could be putting things on tape, could be a host of things that would change the way the kid is taught. But whatever accommodation or modification, the more instructional methods we find in a teacher's toolbox, a higher probability every child will learn in your classroom. How would you characterize what has happened in inclusion in our American school? Some would be a great question if you want to use a research position paper on. Has full inclusion special children been an effective practice? Let's look at what it means and how it defines itself in practice. Inclusion is typically defined as the philosophical and programmatic orientation towards placing kids in the least restrictive environment, regardless of how that student's been categorized. It typically asks teachers to promote and normalize educational experience for students as much as possible and for their families. And its primary component is cooperation between the parents, between administrators and regular education teachers to get this done. The concept was developed out of federal legislation, PLO 94-142, and the term least restrictive environment for you MAT people. This is often will be something you're asked on the PLT. Well, how's that definition of least restrictive environment changed over the past 2 decades? When I started teaching, we called it mainstreaming, and it was where we put kids based on their ability when they could leave the self-contained classroom of the special ed teacher and then move into the regular classroom. That is, they always started in a self-contained, and then as they could progress, they would put him into various academic areas in a normal classroom. Then inclusion in the 90s, as the federal court system and the suits that followed We found the placement started moving into the regular classroom and then bringing the support services to the child. And when we talk about full inclusion, that is a district-wide mandated placement in a regular classroom regardless of the severity and bringing the support services to the classroom, in the sense that we've seen a move from you start in a self-contained classroom, move them out to when they can't function, to full inclusion where you start in the regular classroom and then as they can't function you pull them out. A vast difference in the way we've defined least restrictive environment over the past 2 to 3 decades. In 1975, the Education for All Children Handicapped Act granted the right of children to a public education, and then in the 80s, the Regular Education Initiative calls for a merger of special ed and regular ed, and that led to the IDEA with the 6 premises that we're going to have a much more inclusive practice, that every child has a right to an education, that appropriate education is going to be determined by an analysis of his strengths and weaknesses. We want them to not just be warehoused, but they're going to develop their full potential on all of the indicators that school system is going to be held responsible for. And they have a right to be with non-disabled peers. And so it was a move to reduce the stigma of labeling and placement so that we would find more social acceptance of the disabled. NEA, I think, has one of the best ways of looking at the essentials of any inclusion program, and there are 5. I just want to mention as you look at inclusion. Typically, when it works in a school system, that we find the school system has a full continuum of placement services and options. That is, our teams. We have a very identified IEP plan that says exactly what each team, what each person will be responsible for, and we monitor that regularly. And then the second there is appropriate training, appropriate professional development for all staff, the support staff, and as well as teachers and even administrators to make that program and IEP work. Third, that there be adequate time in the school day to coordinate, to plan on behalf of those kids, and then to teach them. Fourth, that there be appropriate class sizes that are responsive to student needs, that the more included students you have in a class, perhaps, the wiser it is to have a lower class count. And then staff and technical assistance that's specifically appropriate would be needed to help that teacher with para support and other support to make that IEP be very successful. You just don't leave that teacher alone to get the plan done. Well, how would you synthesize the concept, not of so much inclusion, but Kansas answers to those kids that fall between the cracks in inclusion and special ed? Those kids are at risk. But let's find out, to help you answer this question, the second question in this section, let's find out what differentiated instruction actually is. Well, what is differentiated instruction? As it rears its head in the state of Kansas, we call that concept multi-tiered system of support, MTSS. And I guess the overall maxim that we used in the chapter, at least, and to teach all kids the same, you have to teach them differently, might apply here. Now, MTSS is a coherent continuum of evidence-based system-wide practices to support a rapid response to academic and behavioral needs, with frequent data-based monitoring for instructional decision-making to empower each Kansas student to achieve high standards. Now, what's all that mean? basically, it is where a teacher changes the teaching methods to meet the needs of students, and we frequently test them to see if that worked, and if it didn't, you reteach them, and if it did, you move on. But it's a simple concept that basically elementary teachers have been using for quite some time in many ways. Alexi Posey, who was our former Commissioner of Education, here's how she defines it for the state of Kansas, what MTSS really means.
In my mind, the multi-tiered system of support, which we'll commonly refer to as MTSS, is really, it's a systematic way of taking a look at what the schools and districts are already doing very well. It's putting into it a system of the support and interventions that they're providing for the kids who need it. When I think of, the tiers, as we start describing the three tiers, or however many, because every school system can establish their own system. When I think about the very first tier or the first level, that's the core curriculum that every district and every school implements. And every child needs to be successful, and that's the best place to start. Do we have a good core curriculum that allows every child to make sure that they're meeting the standards and assessments and so forth? Then we know that there are a group of kids who that core curriculum may not just be enough, and they need something more. And that's the additional support that we provide, maybe in small groups or whatever else. We also know that within those small groups of support that are provided at that next level of intervention or whatever, there are some kids who will not even be successful at that point in time. Some will catch up because we've provided the support that they needed. Then there's another group of students, those that are really at risk. And we need to provide more intense interventions than ever before. So these kids may respond to that intense intervention, or some of these kids may ultimately be in need of special education services. So when I think about what the multi-tiered system of support, it's just a way of looking at and providing what any child may need to be successful, regardless of label. I often talk about kids are disadvantaged, they're disabled, they're disengaged, they're disenfranchised. It doesn't make any difference what they're labeled. What level of support and intervention do they need to be successful? I think it's critically important. We know, and I applaud the schools and the districts and so forth, because especially in Kansas, we are still in the top 10 in terms of how well our kids perform across the nation. And it's because the educators and administrators and so forth, and the parents and the students themselves really put all their effort that they can into learning, because they really know that education is critically important. In terms of looking at this as part of the system, what it's really doing is it's providing a systemic approach to how we can ensure every child learns. And, it tends to be the kids who live in poverty who tend to be so far behind. And they enter school far behind because they haven't been exposed to words, and they just don't read as well as some others. So when I take a look at this support system, it finally blends a system of education, special education, general education, whatever it is. We are a system of education, regardless of where the funding may come from. And for the first time, this is going to be like a one-stop shop that will allow them to access any of the materials that are already out there.
Well, as you can see, Dr. Posey sees this as a system that answers the RTL or RTI mandates of No Child Left Behind, response to intervention. And it's a multi-tiered system of support that each school system was asked to develop on their own. And there were core beliefs in its initial package, and let me highlight three of them for you that she highlighted. That typically, as schools begin to plan and to look at data, where are their kids and what specific kids are not achieving, and that drives the instructional decisions that are going to be made. And then the interventions will be provided as soon as they show up. You don't wait. It's at the earliest level, and that resources will be intentionally designed and redesigned to match and teach to that student needs until he learns it. And you may have to have more than 3 tiers sometimes for certain students, but that is the decision of the school, and that everyone in that school, from the principal to the counselor to each individual teacher, has that responsibility for planning, implementing, and evaluating. When you look at the model in a 3-tiered simplistic way, at the bottom of the pyramid, all students will, in the initial round, be taught the material. It's a very consistent approach of teaching. All kids will be exposed. The assessment system will be used to find out which kids learned it and which kids didn't. And then those that were not successful went to Tier 2, and there you had small groups typically with individual adult support, and you would be retaught in a different style and retested. The groups were typically small, and they were monitored frequently, and so it targeted the very specific skills they wanted the kid to learn. And the retesting, if you succeed, you went back to the large group instruction. If not, you went on to the 3rd tier, which was typically one-on-one based instruction. And here, many schools had even the principal at times become a teacher. The reading teacher, Title I teacher. You had all kinds of individuals involved in the one-on-one customized interaction so that kid learned that material. But in essence, the concept is simple. You move from large group to small group to individual learning in that system of support for that kid to learn the material. So whether it be our modifications or accommodations or MTSS, we in schools handle diversity, and that diversity makes us strong. The way we treat our at-risk kids, our included kids, as you saw William Daggett, is one of the strengths of the American school systems. So to close, your 2 questions in Chapter 4, Question 1 and 2, this gives you, I think, a little bit of fodder to help you answer your position on those 2 questions. And let me